Hello and thank you for being a member at myfinancesteacher.org. Let's have a look at a range of markets today, and I want to start with cryptocurrencies. The Bitcoin cycle is getting kind of old at 43 days old. The rally has been quite significant. We see a couple of pokes above pretty wide Bollinger Bands. In late October, I think there was a first move down into the cycle low, and over the next couple of weeks, by the time of the usual duration of these cycles, which is around a couple of months, I expect another move down in Bitcoin. So I would expect to increase my Bitcoin positions when Bitcoin price comes down to this 50-day moving average, maybe somewhere around 54,000 or so. Perhaps Bitcoin might retest the previous cycle low that's somewhere around just under 53,000. And after that, as usual, I would expect a rally into a new cycle. Looking at crypto fear and greed, we see that at the moment crypto fear and greed is at 76. And history shows that the ranges above 80 is usually when cycles are kind of topping out and the prices are getting a little bit too hot. Right now, crypto fear and greed is still below 80, so yeah, perhaps there might be another push up over the next couple of days before a decline, perhaps over the next couple of weeks, a few weeks. Looking at Ethereum, I expect something similar here. We see a couple of pokes above Bollinger Bands. They aren't really extremely wide yet, so well, yeah, maybe perhaps another couple of pokes above maybe widening Bollinger Bands into that cycle top, maybe over the next couple of days or a few days before a bit of a correction down into this usual cycle duration, which for Ethereum has historically been just under a couple of months, so say anywhere close to a couple of months as well. So on Bitcoin and on Ethereum, I still expect a decline into some sort of a cycle low into late November. And by then, if the 50-day moving average keeps rising to catch up with the price a little bit, perhaps a correction down to that 50-day moving average and again to the previous cycle low, somewhere around $4,000, might be my entry point for the next cycle rally. Next, let's have a look at crude oil. I think crude oil is just correcting over short term right now, as the intermediate cycle, it's only at 75 days long. Usually these last for around half a year or so. Of course, we've seen RSI overbought and the price has done several pokes above kind of relatively wide Bollinger Bands, not extremely wide. So I expect some sort of a correction. If I manage to catch some sort of a low near this support resistance zone around $76, close to the 50-day moving average and close to the previous cycle high, that's also based on the 2017 high as well. If crude oil comes down to that level, perhaps over the next several days, I'll try to get back into to increase my position size in energy, most likely XLE. Looking at the crude oil optimism index, we see that recently, a few days ago, the optimism index was quite high, above 70. And looking at a couple of previous intermediate cycle lows, for example, over here in early 2020, we see that the first sentiment peaks at somewhere around 70, but the intermediate cycle continues higher into that cycle top and only then cools down into the cycle low. So perhaps topping out of the sentiment is a bit of a leading indicator. As you see, same thing happened over here in mid-2021. By the time everyone is excited, the intermediate cycle isn't done rising. It rallies for another few weeks before cooling down into the intermediate cycle low, somewhere around when the sentiment is also pretty low. That's when you want to re-enter. So as it relates to the ongoing intermediate cycle, as I mentioned, the cycle is still pretty young, only at about 2.5 months old. So I still expect another push higher in crude oil and energies, but at the moment, maybe a bit of a correction over the next few days. Next, looking at copper. As I mentioned in one of my recent videos, I think copper cycle is still relatively young at about 2.5 months old, if I count this 19th of August as the beginning of a new cycle. There is an alternative way of looking at it. Perhaps over here on the 21st of September we see the beginning of a new cycle, that being even a better picture. for crude oil. That's because the usual cycle length since mid-2017 is just over half a year. So perhaps the previous cycle should be counted lasting closer to its usual duration of around 173 days into late September rather than 140 days into mid-August. In either case, even if we count from mid-August, the cycle is still around 2.5 months old. Perhaps after this nice rally in the first half of October, we see a correction down into that downtrend line, also down to this 50-day moving average, and we're also pretty close to the 200-day moving average. So within the ongoing copper cycle, I still expect another push higher. The cycle is still pretty young. Hence, I keep holding COPEX positions as well as XME. We see that XME is bouncing a little bit today from the support of that 50-day moving average, but COPEX has actually dropped below that 50-day moving average. Let's see what happens over the next few days. I think copper should still have another push higher over the next several weeks. And looking at the copper optimism index, yeah, it is somewhat high at around 60, and it's even been as high as around 67 a few days ago near these local highs. But with the economies opening up since the pandemic low, I think over the next several cycles copper might actually top out with the optimism index much higher than the usual topping levels of this red line. Perhaps another push higher in copper with the optimism index reaching above 70, somewhere closer to 80 before the ongoing cycle tops out. And lastly for this video, let's have a look at corn. I think there is a pretty good chance that we have a new cycle in corn starting over here from mid-October. That would give us a pretty short cycle in the second half of 2020, lasting for just over 3 months, for 96 days. That's kind of unusual because the usual cycle duration since 2016, since the beginning of 2016, is about 148 days. But again, perhaps the previous cycle was quite short because the couple of cycles before that were kind of unusually long, lasting for 171 days, 165 days. And as we've noticed in some of our previous videos, sometimes to bring this cycle duration back to that average, we might see a bit of a short cycle after a couple of long cycles. So this relatively strong rally in the second half of October makes me think that we are in a new cycle over here. And I kind of missed this buying opportunity in mid-October because it was a little bit early for the cycle low, and I was expecting corn to give us repeated pokes below these Bollinger Bands before I was going to enter. Now though, looking at corn, my plan is to see this corn perhaps retest this 200-day moving average, some of the recent highs, that's somewhere around 557, 560. Perhaps that will happen over the next couple of days, over the next few days, and once we see a bit of a bounce, I will try to avoid catching a falling knife, although that does happen to me sometimes, to be honest. But in either case, over the next few days, I'll try to make sure I keep an eye on corn, and once we see some sort of a bounce, I'll try to get a long position here as well. Let's have a look at coal. I think there is a good chance coal might be bouncing from close to this 200-day moving average. It's quite unfortunate that our BTU trade stopped out over the last few days, and currently the price is back above our stop loss level. It's kind of unfortunate and quite annoying that sometimes these stop losses do throw me out of a generally playable trade. So what I'm going to do is, I think I'm just going to re-enter back into BTU. BTU has corrected quite significantly by around 1/3, by over 33% since mid-October and since mid-September. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to re-enter once I publish this video, and perhaps this time I'll try without a stop loss. Yeah, it's kind of more risky, of course, but my position size isn't going to be that large anyway. And again, maybe one more thing to look at, and that is uranium. Uranium cycles usually last for around half a year or so. And the ongoing cycle so far, today is the 3rd of November, we don't have the price for uranium futures yet on TradingView. So far the cycle has been going on for 79 days. So usually I would perhaps still expect relatively lower prices over the next several weeks, maybe a bit of a bounce from this 50-day moving average, and again cool down into the cycle low, into the usual cycle duration. But in the longer term picture, uranium is a very hot commodity. And what's happening on URA at the moment is a big green candle that I'm kind of missing out with the relatively smaller positions. Over the last couple of weeks, I was expecting to get back into URA positions, perhaps when the price comes closer to this 50-day moving average and perhaps even closer to the lower range of the Bollinger Bands. Unfortunately, with URA again, I'm left out with a smaller position. Let's see what happens over the next few days. Maybe uranium and uranium miners will consolidate for a little while, even if they don't create a lower low. Maybe a bit of a consolidation, maybe a bit of a triangle consolidation before break out into the next cycle rally. So I'll keep that small position for a while without increasing it at the top of this big green candle. Let me see if I'll try to catch a bit of a cool down over the next couple of weeks. So these are my views as well as some of my plans for a range of markets. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you have any interesting thoughts and ideas, please do share them with the rest of the community as well. Thank you again for being a member, and good luck in your trades.